Greetings, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars discussion of Reinvigorating the American Development Toolkit from the Gates Global Policy Center with former Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates and Wilson Center President and CEO Ambassador Mark Green. My name is Nancy Walker, Senior Advisor for Programs and Public Policy Scholar. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation, which brings together two institutions dedicated to practical, policy-relevant scholarship and two distinguished public servants and bipartisan leaders. The conversation will be moderated by Ms. Samantha Custer, who directs AidData's Policy Analysis Unit. The Gates Forum, Reinvigorating the American Foreign Policy Toolkit, supports one of Secretary Gates's long-held and strongly held views, namely, that while the military component of national security must remain strong, it is imperative that we have much greater support in dollars and in leadership to the civilian components: diplomacy, economics, trade and investment, strategic communications, development assistance. Secretary Gates made headlines in November 2007 by calling for the U.S. government to spend more money and effort on soft power. In an article in Foreign Affairs in 2020, The Over-Militarization of American Foreign Policy, he argues for the United States to re-engage the full symphony of American power, stating that increased support for soft power, diplomacy, strategic communications, economic assistance is very much in U.S. national interests, specifically in U.S. national security interests. The previous Gates Forum focused on one such component: competitive global engagement and strategic communications and public diplomacy for a new era, with insightful recommendations for what could simply be called a new USIA on steroids. This recent Gates Forum tackles another aspect of the civilian components of national security: development assistance. With data and analysis from our colleagues at AidData, insight and expertise from government, the private sector, civil society, and academia, in this report you will hear about the importance of leadership, of building relationships, of providing incentives, showing pragmatism, having lots and lots of good hard data, embracing coordination and teamwork, and empowering partners. With that, please allow me to turn the virtual microphone over to our colleague from AidData, Ms. Samantha Custer, who will call upon our two experts to offer their insights to you. Samantha, over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and to the Wilson Center for hosting us today for this critical conversation. Many thanks also to Ambassador Green and Secretary Gates for joining us today. So to set the stage for the conversation, we are living in an increasingly competitive global landscape. And in this environment, America must articulate a clearer value proposition of itself as a preferred development partner. And to do so, U.S. leaders need to think about three critical ingredients. First, we need to go back to the basics. We need strategic clarity about what we want development assistance to achieve, where, how, and why. Second, we need to strengthen and expand America's development toolkit to ensure that it is truly fit for purpose to crowd in civil society and private sector actors, to coordinate effectively with allies, and to be responsive to our partners in low and middle income countries. And third, America is strongest when we don't try to do this alone. We need to look for like-minded allies and partners, international organizations, private sector actors, bilateral partners that are willing to work together with us to advance shared development values. So with that stage set, Ambassador Green, Secretary Gates, I want to start with the strategic questions first, the why of development assistance. So with that in mind, let me go to Secretary Gates first. So we know that America has many problems here at home: economic inflation, social inequality, political polarization, among many other challenges. Secretary Gates, I want to hear from you. Why should the U.S. invest scarce resources into strengthening development assistance abroad when we have all of these other factors in play?
Samantha, I think that the place to start there is historically, and that is that the question you just asked has been asked by critics of development assistance since President Truman proposed assistance to Turkey and Greece after the Second World War to try and help them recover from the war and to develop a strong democracy and strong economy to prevent a communist takeover in both countries. So from the very beginning, development assistance has really been about serving American national interests, both economic and security. Um, and from an economic standpoint, first of all, what we now tend to call the global South, which is the majority of countries in the world by far, in many respects are going to determine how this relationship between the United States and its allies in Europe on the one hand, and in Asia, such as Japan and Australia, how that competition with Russia and China develops over time. The Chinese clearly believe that development assistance is a central part of the national security toolkit, and that really lies behind their Belt and Road initiative, which more than 100 countries have signed up for, including several in Western Europe. So they see it as clearly important, but I think we should as well. And I think it's both a matter of how this competition turns out, but it's also in our own interest. Economically, assisting countries to develop strong economies and stable governments is in our economic interest because they become markets, they become trading partners, they become sources of commodities and other goods for the United States. So the trade relationship becomes important and serves both their interest and our interest. From a security standpoint, having democratic governments and strong governance and good education in developing countries is also in our interest. The Chinese are trying to develop clients throughout the developing world, seeking ports for their navy, establishing contracts for commodities and other goods, exclusive contracts that serve China's interests. So I think as I say, the question of why are we doing this instead of spending the money here at home, I would argue, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to take care of the problems we have here at home, but we have the resources in this country to be able to also have development assistance. Let me just conclude this answer with a broader statement. If we are able to avoid a military confrontation, particularly with China, then this competition with China will be waged very much the same way the Cold War was waged with the Soviet Union. Because we were able to avoid a military competition, it was the non-military instruments of power that ultimately led to our success in the Cold War. Economics, technology, development assistance, strategic communications, and so on. These are the non-military tools with which a non-military conflict, a conflict short of military confrontation takes place. And we have neglected all of these tools since the end of the Cold War. So this is an arena, development assistance is an arena where there are a lot of good ideas, a lot of interesting things have been done in recent years to modernize the way we approach it, but it is a critical element of our toolkit.
Thank you very much, Secretary Gates. Ambassador Green, let me turn to you. So Secretary Gates makes a fairly compelling argument, I think, about the fact that development assistance is truly in our national interests, a multitude of interests. And yet you and I both know, and Secretary Gates alluded to the history of this is not the first time that development assistance has encountered criticism or difficulty in mobilizing a domestic coalition of support. So I want to hear from you, in your experience, how would you make the case to American taxpayers and political leaders that development is worth the investment after all?
Well, first off, I agree with everything that the Secretary has said. I'm an admirer of the Secretary, and I'm an admirer now of the Gates Global Policy Center and Aid Data. It's great to work with you. So he's dead on the mark, right? This is in our self-interest. This is about preventing war and the conditions that lead to instability. As I used to always put it, look, poverty does not cause terrorism. However, destitution left unchecked can lead to despair, and despair is a condition that bad guys, from terrorists to authoritarians, know how to exploit, and exploit effectively. So this really is in our own security interest. I'd also like to highlight what the Secretary referred to, economic interest. We have to keep reminding ourselves, 95% of the world's population lives outside the borders, territorial borders of the United States of America. We need to open markets. We need to have consumers. We need to have economic relationships. That helps our own economy grow. So it's also about our economic self-interest. And finally, the late Mike Gerson, who was in the Bush administration, helped to craft PEPFAR and a longtime columnist for the Washington Post, as he also used to say, look, it's good for our soul. So when we talk and show American compassion in action, we sort of polish that model of being a shining city on the hill, and that is what so many aspire to and are led by all around the world. So it's also good to reinforce the values in our own way of life, but values to which so many aspire around the world.
So we are really landing on this theme that there is an altruism about development assistance that is, in your words, Ambassador, good for the soul and good for the country and our institutions. But you both agree on this idea that it is also in our self-interest, in our economic interest, in our security interests, in our relational interests. But of course, as we know, there are a number of different development providers and suppliers on the world stage. It's becoming a more contested marketplace when it comes to where countries look to source financing for their development, and also the ideas and models to which they aspire for their country's future. And so, Secretary Gates, I want to turn to you for a moment and think about this situation where we're in a more contested marketplace for countries that are achieving peace and prosperity. How should America articulate its unique value proposition for what we can offer the world compared to these other players?
I think for openers, it is making sure that the development assistance arrangements are win-wins, that the country that is the recipient of development assistance sees that its own interests are being advanced, that its own economy is being developed, that its own people are being served. Our development assistance programs take into account things like sustainability, the environment. They teach about democracy. When we're in education, we teach about democracy and human rights and so on. We also in our projects, our purpose is to build capability in the government, in the country where we're doing the development. So our projects involve local government officials, local business people, local citizens. And when we are hiring people, we hire locals, teach them how to do the job so that when we're gone, they're able to do that. It contrasts pretty vividly with the way the Chinese approach this, not to mention the debt trap of Belt and Road projects and so on that people have written about. But the Chinese really don't care very much or at all about the environment, the consequences of the mines that they open and the projects that they undertake. But they also, part of Belt and Road is that they require that the local governments contract with Chinese companies to do the construction. And they generally provide Chinese workers to do the construction in the projects in those countries. So they have big, bold projects and arenas and roads and things like that, which do serve in some ways the country. But they are basically Chinese loans, built with Chinese loans and built with Chinese labor and with Chinese companies. So they're not looking to the development of that country. They're looking to just get a project done. And what we're trying to do in our projects, and Mark knows a lot more about this than I do from direct experience, but our whole purpose is how do we strengthen that country economically and in terms of its governance so that they become a good trading partner in the future, but also so that they provide this bulwark against what Mark referred to as the desperation, the despair that leads to extremism. So there underlying all of the things that we do in development assistance is how do we strengthen the recipient country, both politically, but also economically and in terms of their own security. That's the value proposition, it seems to me, that the United States offers.
Thank you very much, Secretary Gates. So what I hear you saying a lot is that it's not just about the quantity of development projects, development financing that we're offering, but we're also really talking about the quality of the type of assistance we provide, whether it's thinking about sustainability in the long term from an environment perspective, thinking about economic sustainability and local capacity. Ambassador Green, let me turn to you. So it strikes me that many of America's tools and structures to deliver development assistance have evolved in response to global challenges. So you can think about post-World War II reconstruction or curbing communism in the Cold War, countering terrorism after 9/11, addressing the HIV/AIDS, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemics. So building upon what Secretary Gates said about our value proposition and this history that we have, help us imagine, help us to reinvigorate our minds to think about what do development assistance tools and structures look like tomorrow to meet those global challenges that are evolving before our eyes?
Well, the challenges that are evolving involve such things as human displacement. Later this year, the United Nations Refugee Agency is going to project that there are 130 million displaced people in the world, and that number is growing. 400,000 children are born as refugees each year. And so there's a rapidly growing challenge that we need to be part of the answer to. But in terms of the possibilities, there are two main changes that I've seen in my time in the development space. Number one is technology. The world is shrinking. The possibilities and the challenges are immense because of technology. When I started off some decades ago as a teacher in Kenya, there was a single wind-up telephone in my village. None of my students knew they were poor. None of my students had ever traveled more than about 10 kilometers away from where they were born. And so they didn't understand the possibilities. They also didn't understand what others around them had that they did not. And that's all changed. The world is very connected in that sense. Second part of that in terms of technology, smart card technology and drone technology, which allows us to help connect the world in other important ways. So we get to emphasize human dignity by delivering assistance through smart card technology that helps those displaced mothers actually have some choices when they go to purchase food from the local marketplace. We also get to keep better records of immunizations and nutrition so we can make sure that we invest in women and girls on the front end. So all of those are I think, remarkable possibilities. But the other big change, the one that we don't talk about enough, when USAID was founded decades ago, something like 10% of all the money that flowed from the U.S. to the developing world was private sector. All the rest of it was what we call ODA, which you know very well, official development assistance, old style foreign assistance. Those numbers have flipped. Right now, business realizes it has business in the developing world. And those financial flows, those investments, those markets, those present enormous opportunities. If we harness private enterprise and line up with those flows, we can achieve things in terms of poverty reduction and capacity building that were unimaginable not so very long ago. So the possibilities are enormous. The challenges are different. The challenges are greater in some ways, but also the tools that we have are better than ever. Directly to your question, part of what we need to do is reorganize ourselves to align with those developments. We need to harness technology better. We also need to do a much better job in collaborating with private enterprise in the private sector. We still don't do that as well as we need to. These days, when we talk about working with private business, too often we really mean contractors and contracts. We don't really mean, as we should, private investment. Working with those agribusiness companies that are looking to be able to export drought-resistant seed, fertilizer, updated fertilizer possibilities in different areas. They're simply looking for access to markets, which the public sector can help with. So we have all the tools. We need to align them better, and we need to focus them on the rapidly emerging challenges.
Let me follow up to one of the themes that you mentioned, Ambassador Green, which is the need to better harness the private sector and not to artificially limit our thinking to contractors. And so, I said at the start of this conversation that getting more from U.S. development assistance means remembering that we aren't doing this alone. And that's true of the U.S. government, that's true of other actors. So let's get into specifics a little bit more here. So how could the U.S. government better mobilize willing partners from private companies, universities, civic groups, and more to work together towards common goals?
All kinds of ways. So normally when we design programs in the development community, the development agency community, we create a contract, we create a program, and then we say, could someone come and do this for us? As opposed to saying, look, this is a sector we all want to work in. These are the things we'd like to achieve. What are your ideas about how we might get there? So it's bringing private enterprise in the front end in program design. So we need to move from a term that I dislike intensely, public-private partnerships, I don't know what that means, to collaboration. We need to go to a collaboration ethic in which we bring in private business, other agencies, other partners, other governments, and say, hey, look, this is an area that's important to us. What are your ideas? How can we design the programs appropriately? So it really is involving other players up front and making sure that they're not the last thought, but they're the first thought. Then in terms of how we work better in the field, what we need to do is be in constant conversation with the private sector and say, hey, look, what stops you from investing more in country X? What are the barriers? What are the hindrances? And then work together to take those on. You made a reference to contractors. Contractors are irreplaceable. They're really important. They achieve important things, but that's not private enterprise. They're different things. We need both. We need to work with contractors on delivery mechanisms, absolutely play an important role. But private enterprise, for-profit private business, which is trying to work in different parts of the world, which is looking to open up markets, we can work with them in ways that open up markets and opportunities, but also help all of us achieve goods. Again, it's going back to this notion, and the Secretary laid it out so well. We want every country in the world to go from being aid recipients to partners to fellow donors. We want to get there, and the way that you get there is by creating enough economic opportunity so that countries can take care of their own challenges, and also they have the ability to partner and work with others.
So, Secretary Gates, I would like to go to you. So the dynamics that Ambassador Green was describing when it comes to unlocking the dynamism of the private sector here at home in the U.S. context, and it's a both and, if I understand the ambassador's point, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. It's about implementers, but it's about collaborators. It's about all of the diversity and richness of U.S. society working together. But Secretary Gates, let's cast an eye internationally. In the defense context, and security context, we often talk about close allies and partners working together towards shared security. How well are we doing in mobilizing like-minded partners to work together with us on development assistance? And what would you like to see happen in future?
So let me just, before I answer that, let me go back to what the ambassador was talking about, because I really agree with him so much. But I think it's worth mentioning, in some ways, there's not been a lack of ideas and new initiatives to try and make our development assistance more impactful and easier to defend, frankly. So under President Bush, you had PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, which I think literally everybody would agree saved tens of millions of lives in Africa. but also created an infrastructure, a local infrastructure in all of the recipient countries of that assistance of a basic level healthcare capability. It illustrates exactly what we've been talking about. We leave behind something that endures. In the countries that were PEPFAR recipients and had local labs and so on, when an Ebola uh, epidemic came along later, they were able to identify it quickly and capture and kill it basically. Whereas the countries that had not participated in PEPFAR had much more serious problems. So that's one example. Another under President Bush was the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which just recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. A new concept in terms of how you deliver for development assistance. In the Obama administration, you had Power Africa, which was a good example of how you partner with the private sector in encouraging the private sector to invest in Africa in terms of meeting the electric power needs of the country. Under President Trump, we had the Development Finance Corporation to help encourage companies to invest in developing countries, as well as Prosper Africa, which was another program to try and improve assistance in that regard. So under both Republicans and Democrats, there have been continuing efforts to enhance the capabilities that we have in this arena, and I think that that kind of effort continues. The problem that we have, and let me start with at home and then switch to internationally. The problem we have at home is we have now something like 20 different government agencies doing development assistance, and there's no one that coordinates all of that. Every embassy, on average, has between 17 and 18 of those agencies in the embassy. Many of them, in some respects, the smallest, have 8 different U.S. government institutions that are doing aid in one way or another. How do you synchronize all of that? How do you get those people on the same page and working in parallel or in collaboration with one another? That's a huge problem. Resources is another problem. How do you fund these things properly? Millennium Challenge Corporation has done an amazing job, but they're starved of resources and can only do a very small number of countries. When you turn to the international environment, and let me make one last point about the private sector in the U.S., and I include non-governmental organizations here. So let me give you an example from Afghanistan. So Nancy mentioned at the outset that I was president of Texas A&M. So as Secretary of Defense, one of the things that that I realized was that AID did not have the resources to properly carry out assistance in Afghanistan in agriculture and livestock, in terms of best practices, seeds, you name it. And the land grant universities in the United States, like Texas A&M, already had researchers in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in these places, carrying out these programs. And I said to the State Department, why don't you partner with these land grant universities? They already have people in the field. They've got more people that are willing to go. They're accustomed to living in insecure circumstances and in very basic primitive conditions. Why don't you partner with them? State Department never once reached out. Never once reached out to the land grant universities. And the irony is the land grant association in DC, in Washington, DC, at the time was headed by Peter McPherson, who had been not only the president of Michigan State, but also the director of AID. So he knew how to do this, and we didn't do it. So there's a mindset also inside the government about reaching to the outside and figuring out how to partner with other people. And then finally, on the international front, many countries, particularly in Europe, but also in Asia, Japan and others, have very active development assistance programs, and they're really good. And they get, as a percentage of GDP, they spend more than we do. Nearly all of them do. and they have some very effective programs, but we don't really have any kind of a mechanism for how we can sit down and not only and share information about where we're working, what we're doing, and how can we contribute to each other's efforts, and how can we amplify our impact by working together. I saw this firsthand in Afghanistan when I was secretary. We had dozens and dozens of countries and NGOs in Afghanistan doing development assistance. They didn't talk to each other. None of them talked to each other. You'd have the Dutch in one province and you'd have the Germans in an adjacent province. And you would have flows of people, you would have roads and everything else connecting the two. And yet those two donors never talked to each other. There was no coordination. There was an effort to try and do this through the UN with the appointment of the UN coordinators, Kai Ida, at one point, the whole purpose of which was to try and get these countries to talk to each other and collaborate and cooperate. It failed. It didn't work, despite his best efforts. So we are missing a huge opportunity, it seems to me, in the failure to have mechanisms like NATO, but on the development assistance side, where we talk to each other, we share information, we share best practices, we share what works, what doesn't work. So I think there's some real opportunities here. And so it's resources for the domestic side and greater synchronization, but it's also greater collaboration internationally.
Samantha, if I can sort of do a two-finger tap on that, I completely agree. You know, when you look at the U.S. government, we have a huge number of very good tools, but we don't organize or align them in ways that optimize results. And that's a shame. It's a pity. We're not nearly as effective as we can be. Secondly, every single agency at mission wants its own little logo, its own little fiefdom. We confuse our partners out there. I remember some years ago, I was the speaker at World AIDS Day, and I went into a football stadium to speak, and I noticed all of the acronyms around the top. I couldn't identify them, and then I realized as a congressman, I probably created most of them. And that's in English, and I wonder for those who English may be their third language, what it is that they think. So we're disorganized, we're not nearly as well aligned as we need to be. The Secretary is absolutely right on the international level. Out at post in the mission, the good news is the good, effective ambassadors are in communication, and we can look at ways of pooling resources. But remember that our authorities back here, we get money allocated and earmarked for certain things, and you can't move it around. So instead of our mission directors or chiefs of mission having the flexibility to be able to move to changing conditions, the money is absolutely locked in a certain way, and it's a pity. You spoke earlier about China, one of the other players that's out there. You know, let's be clear, when it comes to taking on humanitarian challenges, welcome him in. Love to have them come to the table. I would love to have them contribute humanitarian assistance to lifting lives and taking on conditions. They tend not to. That's not something that they do. And it's a great pity. We need partners. We need to share burdens. We need to work together to try to benefit some of those countries out there that are facing challenges and looking for ways to emerge and rise. There's more than enough room, and the challenges are great enough. There's plenty of room for us to all be involved. We just need to do a better job amongst ourselves, talking better and more explicitly about different things we can do, but also overseas around the world, much better coordination.
Let me just add one anecdote about the need for a greater flexibility in the United States government, just one story. So during, when we were at war in Afghanistan, Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, called me and said, I have 60 or 70 agricultural agronomists, agricultural experts who are willing to volunteer and go to Afghanistan and help. And it never happened because I couldn't transfer any money to pay the expenses of those ag experts. Tom had the people, but he didn't have the money, and it was in the broader context of things, it was a rounding error in terms of the cost. And I couldn't give him a dime. I had a special provision that allowed me to transfer some money to the State Department, but I had no ability under the law to transfer even very modest amounts of money to agriculture to make them a partner in all the things we've been talking about.
And in partnering with private businesses, you know, we Americans sometimes forget, when I look, and I spent much of my career in Africa, when you ask an African in, say, my old country of Tanzania, when they think of America, what do they think of? They don't actually think of Congress. They don't actually think of the State Department or the Pentagon. They think of all of it. It's the vision of America, a growing economy and compassion. It's Coca-Cola, it's Apple, it's all of those business brands. Why we aren't harnessing that and putting that to their advantage and to ours, it's a pity. We're stuck in this notion that it has to be rigid agencies, rigid programs. Don't move anything around. You know, don't be transparent. Don't look for ways of partnering. And it makes no sense. We confuse and confound those who were seeking to benefit.
Given the amount of players that we have been talking about and the challenge of coordinating effectively across those players, and also this conversation thread about the difficulty of deploying money flexibly to where it needs to go most, it would be easy for somebody listening in to assume we're talking about a fairly meaty part of the U.S. budget and U.S. economy when we talk about development assistance. But as you both know, that is misinformation. You know, we're talking about less than 1% of the federal budget and actually 0.22% of the U.S. gross national income. And so with that in mind, just given how small, you know, those conventional development assistance dollars are, that drop in the bucket that was referred to earlier, it's striking to me that when you look at other tools of economic statecraft that the U.S. has at its disposal, namely trade and foreign direct investment, there seems to be fairly little overlap between the countries that receive most of our official development assistance dollars, as Ambassador Green was talking about, versus those that are interacting with the Coca-Colas of the world and the trade and investment there. Secretary Gates, you talked a lot about the importance of embracing a symphony of U.S. power. And so I want to go to you first. How do you think that America's aid, trade, and investment could work better together to advance development sustainably?
Well, one really good example of an American development assistance program was Plan Colombia. It was supported with bipartisan support on the Hill. It actually had its roots in the Clinton administration, and was funded through the succeeding 4 presidents to the tune of about $10 billion. And while the program was not particularly successful in stemming the drug trade, it did prevent Colombia from becoming a narco state. It allowed the government to survive and to reestablish control over the country and begin to deal with the insurgencies and so on. So it was very successful. Interestingly, it was led by the whole program was led by the State Department. The Congress, in this instance, very wisely capped the number of U.S. military who could go there for training purposes at about 800. First was 400, and then it was expanded to 800, which made sure that the civilian components of the program dominated. And there were a significant contribution from the Justice Department and so on. But one of the key elements that made Plan Colombia successful, and it was controversial at the time, but it was successful, was a free trade agreement with Colombia. And one of the sad things, in my opinion, today is that politicians in both of our parties have become allergic to free trade and to trading agreements. And they may be open on occasion to some bilateral trade agreements, but we miss a bet when we are not part of trading organizations. And I mean, The Mexico-Canada U.S. trade agreement has been a huge boon for all three countries. I think it was a big mistake for us to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Uh, and so I think we don't understand that trade has more benefits than just the dollar value of what's being exchanged. Uh, China is now the biggest trading partner of more than 120 countries in the world. They are the biggest trading partner of every country in South America, with perhaps one exception, certainly with Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and so on. That has political implications. And we are missing a huge bet when we neglect trade as a key element of our overall strategy, national security strategy, as we look to the rest of the world, not to mention the role it can play in development assistance. I mean, in some ways, the whole purpose of development assistance in the economic arena is to help those countries develop a stable economy and become exporters and become part of the global trading environment. That's to their benefit. It's to our benefit. And we've not, because of the political allergy, as I said, to trade, we this is a big bet that we are missing out on, that also is an opportunity to collaborate with all of our allies who have a very different approach.
So the secretary is 100% right. I also bemoan the lack of real trade agenda in Washington right now. When we don't do trade, we have, as I put it, broken the deal with much of the developing world, because what it is that we offer is eventually to become full-on trading partners and to be equal trading partners as we both try to provide growing economies and economic opportunities for our people. And so when we don't do trade, I wonder what it is that we think we're actually offering, for example, in Africa. When I travel around Africa, they don't want handouts. They're not looking for old style assistance. They're looking to be empowered. They're looking to have opportunities to take care of the economic opportunities for their young people. And so when we don't do trade, we're doing a disservice. We're also undermining, as the Secretary put it, our own programs. The opportunities are there for it to work hand in hand with development. So good investments, catalytic investments by USAID and others into some of these countries makes all the world of difference. So in the agribusiness case, as I mentioned, we had a great agribusiness partner that was looking to provide its drought-resistant seed into various African countries. So what did USAID do? What we did is work with the host country government to do everything we could to speed along approvals, but also do trainings to local farmers so they understood the advantages of these seeds and how to use them. So USAID was doing just a little piece of it, just a small investment, and the agribusiness partner was making money, as they should, but we were providing to farmers the very seed that they need to maximize output and also to be more resilient against climate extremes. So there's a very important role for the public sector to play, a catalytic one, but we should be turning more and more to our great companies and businesses that are looking for just a little bit of help to open up markets and create opportunities.
So what I hear both of you making an argument for is the role of patient investment, both on the part of the government to be that catalytic actor to help boost local productivity, and then to embrace things like free trade agreements and other mechanisms that get the incentives right for both countries to work together towards shared economic gains. But that strikes me as this long-term view is increasingly difficult to hold on to in a world that is increasingly dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. And we're talking about everything from conflict and natural disasters to food insecurity and health pandemics. And it is striking to me, looking at the history of U.S. development assistance, that a growing share of the U.S. assistance budget has been oriented over the years to helping countries respond to and recover from these emergencies. So back in 2010, we were talking about 17% of assistance. Now it's over 1/3 as of 2021. So in this environment, should we be concerned that the crisis orientation of our assistance is coming at the expense of this long-term patient investment in economic growth and democracy in poorer countries? Ambassador Green, I'll go to you first on that question.
Sure, I think it's a real concern. We want to be able to do both. We have a long-term mission, a long-term purpose important to our partners. And if we're constantly having to sort of argue or debate what portion of money can go towards those things, I think we're making a mistake. Also, we have to remember when it comes to such things as human displacement, humanitarian assistance in some ways is a necessary evil. We do it because we believe we have a moral obligation, and our partners accept it because they have to. It's an emergency response. But it's not what they seek in the long run. What they seek are opportunities to lead themselves and to build sustainable growth path, every community, every family. And so we have to find ways to do both. One of the things that we tried to do when I was at USAID is to take the humanitarian assistance and sort of build in elements of resilience into it. I remember working in Ethiopia, trying to find ways to teach practices and to make investments with Ethiopian farmers. They had gone through 5 consecutive years of drought, trying to help them get in front of some of this to build their resilience to be able to withstand these shocks. But it is a concern. I think we need to do a more full-throated call for others to join. The U.S. is far and away the largest humanitarian donor in the world, and the last time I checked, 2, 3, and 4 added together don't equal what we do. I am proud of what it is that we do. There is room for others to help out. We need their help in taking on these challenges, because these challenges are not the problems in most cases of a single country. They're international problems. They deserve an international response. But there is a rub there that we need to keep our eye on, as you suggest.
Secretary Gates, it occurs to me that in your vantage point as Secretary of Defense, you were working or had visibility on many of these post-conflict reconstruction environments where you're trying to get civilian and military agencies working together on these complex situations, both responding to the crisis, but then also planning for the long term. In your view, what would you add to Ambassador Green's comments in terms of how we could get humanitarian assistance and development assistance work better together?
I think what's important would be to build on what Mark was talking about, is wherever we can to use to structure the humanitarian assistance in a way that helps the local government build resilience in its own capabilities to deal with these disasters in the future. And the reality that I think we face and particularly due to climate change, is that the same countries the same countries are repeatedly going to be victims, whether it's tsunamis or drought, and so on. And so figuring out how to help them build capability, and the research work that you oversaw for the last Gates Global Forum, Samantha, there were a couple of examples, including Nepal, which has a continuing problem with earthquakes, and we use the development assistance. It's a great example of how the development assistance or humanitarian assistance was actually used to build long-term resilience within the Nepalese government to be able to deal with some of these problems. But I think that this kind of transition, figuring out a better way to do that, to make sure that it's built into all of our humanitarian assistance, is simply the importance of recognizing that the same countries are likely to be hit over and over again and year after year. I mean, how many earthquakes does it take in Haiti or in the Pacific and so on? So I think Mark makes a great point in terms of how you do that. And I'm all for naming and shaming the failure of the Chinese to show up in the humanitarian world. They just don't do it. The one aspect of this that I wanted to mention that we haven't talked about is the importance of synchronizing our development assistance also with our strategic communications, because too often what we do in both development assistance and humanitarian assistance goes unnoticed by the rest of the world because we don't call the attention of the rest of the world to it. One of the examples that I came across in doing my own research was in 1999, during the North Korean famine. The United States was far and away the biggest food donor to North Korea, 3 times as much food aid as they got from China. And nobody in the world knew that. I mean, I was in the US government. I didn't know it. And a similar instance, there was an earthquake in Iran in 2004 or 5. And we sent, it was the first time since the revolution in 1979, US military aircraft flew into Iran and to deliver humanitarian assistance, medical and other kinds of humanitarian assistance. Nobody in the world knew that here we are sending assistance, humanitarian assistance, to our worst adversaries in the world. And yet we were doing that. So I think, Mark talked about going into arena and seeing all the logos and so on and so forth. We do a terrible job, not just with our own people, but with people around the world, of highlighting what we are doing to help. The fact that we're the biggest donor in the world by far in humanitarian assistance, nobody knows that. So we need a better strategic communications strategy in parallel with our development and humanitarian assistance programs, because first of all, it helps the American people understand where their dollars are going. If they see that we're delivering food aid in a famine in Ethiopia or in Somalia, and they see starving people lining up and getting bags from the people of the United States, that has an impact here at home. And so I just think we're missing a big bet in this arena that frankly, going back to your earliest questions, would also help build domestic support.
Yeah, and I just a quick thing. I'm from flyover country. I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I remember the number of times I'd be on the campaign trail, and a guy would come up to me and say, I hate foreign assistance, and I'd say, well, what about providing, HIV meds to people who are HIV positive? Well, I support that. I just hate foreign assistance. And pretty soon after you actually talk about where the money's going, they say, well, okay, but I still hate foreign assistance. So I think if we do a better job of helping people to understand what this actually looks like, they'll still hate foreign assistance, but maybe we'll blunt it a little bit.
And maybe they won't think the foreign assistance budget is bigger than the Pentagon's budget.
That's right. Hear, hear.
So with that, this has been a fascinating conversation. Ambassador Green, Secretary Gates, thank you so much for sharing your insights on what is needed to revitalize America's development toolkit and why we need to do a better job communicating its value here at home and abroad. And for those of you listening in, I hope we have convinced you that change is needed and now is the time for action. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Nancy Walker to close us out. Thank you for listening in.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Ambassador Green. Thank you, Secretary Gates. And thank you all for watching this insightful discussion on U.S. national security, on development assistance, on the importance of soft power from most definitely practitioners' perspectives. For more information about the Gates Global Policy Center's Reinvigorating the American Development Toolkit, please find links to the report, to aid data, and to the Gates Center on the website page with the invitation to this event. Thank you all very much for tuning in.